Okay, we ended last time in Genesis, and Genesis ended with Joseph and his family all in Egypt, and everything seems to be going pretty well. And finally, then Joseph dies. This is the end of Genesis. Joseph dies, and his family's all living in Egypt now. Joseph is embalmed with the expectation that one day his bones will be transported back to the homeland, back to Canaan. Uh, so Exodus actually begins with a description of that whole setting. I'm going to go to chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. It says, "And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and multiplied, and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them." And then it says in verse 8, "Now a king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And that's the key to the whole scenario of Exodus is set with that in mind, that now there comes a king who's ruling in Egypt that doesn't know Joseph, because Joseph was basically a hero in the land. He was the second most powerful man in all of Egypt and all of the world, essentially. And so we skip from there. We get the generations pass, but Israel is growing. It's just a big family now. They're a big family living in a foreign nation. They're not yet become a nation themselves. That will happen in Exodus as they receive the law. That becomes a national entity. Right now they're just a gigantic family, and the first they were living in a good situation, and now it slowly moves into a situation where the king doesn't remember Joseph. Nobody knows about Joseph anymore. They're just afraid of the multitude of Israelites that are there, and they begin to make them into slaves. This is, if we remember back in Genesis 15, God told Abraham that his descendants would be slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. So the fear of the multitude is causing the Pharaoh, the leader of the king of Egypt, such fear that he tells the midwives of the Israelites to be killing any baby boys that are born. He says, "We're just afraid. There's so many of these Israelites, but the midwives courageously refuse. And what they do is their excuse is they say that, well, the Hebrew women aren't like your women. They're so hardy, they're so well conditioned that by the time we get to them, they've had their babies and they're already there, and we don't have a chance to get the boys and kill them." So they were making up a story, but they courageously defied Pharaoh in that. And it says in verse 21 of chapter 1 of Exodus, "And it came about because the midwives feared God that he established households for them." So they feared God, they did what God wanted, they didn't kill the children, even though that was the mandate in the nation. We kind of feel that pressure right now in this nation, that it's becoming fashionable to kill our babies, but they refused to do that. And then in verse 22 of chapter 1 it says, "Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive." So they're just going to throw the boys into the Nile River. And it was into this setting that Moses is born. And of course, if you follow the story, which you should read through, they're great story. I mean, this is the whole story of Moses, one of my favorites. Joseph, one of my favorites. We just got done in Genesis. Maybe my all-time favorite in the Old Testament, actually. But with Moses here, he's born into this setting, and he is actually taken, and he is essentially thrown into the river. But he's in a basket, and his sister's following him down the river to see what happens. And what happens is that Pharaoh's daughter finds him floating in this basket, has compassion, takes him in, and she raises him. And the sister says, "Oh, do you need a nurse?" And and she says, "Yes." So she goes to get their mom. So mom actually gets to nurse Moses. An incredible scenario that worked out there for them. So Moses grows up. He tries to defend. He finds out he's an Israelite. He defends an Israelite slave and kills an Egyptian man. Goes out again the next day, and people realize, I've seen it. They know about it, and he gets fearful and he flees Egypt, and he goes to a place called Midian, and he lives there for 40 years. Now Midian, I believe, is actually the setting, and it's the actual land, I believe, where Mount Sinai is at. So he's living in Midian for 40 years, gets to know the area, and has an encounter with what we call the burning bush. And it's used in society today. Is just biblical understanding is important just for phrases that are used in our society. You know, people talk about having a burning bush experience or something. And in the burning bush is, of course, where Moses heard the voice of God. He drew near to it because he saw the bush on fire, but it wasn't being consumed. Now, I know a couple people that have gone over to where I believe Mount Sinai is, and it's funny because they show this. There's not very much vegetation there at all, and they all focus in on this one bush. Could that be the burning bush? You know, I don't know. It was there for a few thousand years, but most of them that have been there said it doesn't look like the place has been disturbed since Moses was here. So it is, but there was a bush that was on fire but not being consumed. Moses was curious, went over. God spoke to him, said, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. And God spoke to him and said, you know, I'm going to use you to go back to Egypt and free my people. Well, you know, there's all kinds of arguments in there, discussions that Moses has with God, like, I can't, you know, I'm not a speaker, I can't talk. He does a real eloquent speech saying how he can't speak, but God gets a little upset with him, says, well, Aaron can speak for you, your brother. And so anyway, Moses is called to this setting to go back to Egypt to set his people free. And God reveals himself at this time. Moses says, who shall I say sent me? And he says, Yahweh, or I am that I am. I am that I am has sent you. And that name, Jehovah, we say Jehovah or Yahweh, for it's a tetramagon, I never can get that word right. Anyway, it's the four letters that are used, YHWH, basically in our alphabet, that form that name, and then vowels are put in to help pronounce the name. And so we either say Yahweh or Jehovah, transliterating it into English. But that name is used in conjunction with several other names or other words to form covenant names of God. Like we saw in Genesis, Jehovah Jireh, my God shall supply. And we're about ready to get another one here in Exodus. But anyway, Moses told he's going to lead his people out of Egypt. They're going to lead them into a land of milk and honey, which kind of gives a good reputation for milk there. Milk's kind of taken it kind of hard in the recent years, but you're a land of milk and honey, that's a good place. And Moses is given two signs when he goes to present this petition before Pharaoh to say, let my people go. He's given two signs. One is that the staff that he throws on the ground will turn into a serpent, and the second one is when he puts his hand into his bosom, it says, and around his chest area, and pulls it out, it'll be leprous. It'll be white like leprosy, and then when he puts it back in, it will go away. So he's got these two signs. Those are pretty powerful signs that he's got. And so he goes in and tells Pharaoh, says, you know what, you need to let my people go. God says, let my people go. And Pharaoh refuses. Moses says, you know, we're going to turn the water into blood. And so each time through these plagues that come, and that does actually happen, but each time these plagues come, Pharaoh says, okay, I'm going to let your people go and just stop the plague. And so Moses stops the plague, and Pharaoh's heart hardens. He relents on his promise, and he keeps the people in slavery until the final one that we'll look at in a bit, until the death of the firstborn. So these plagues begin to come. The first one is this water turning to blood. The Nile River turns into blood. On the way to this point, there's a thing that happens, is that God does make a distinction between Egyptians and Israelites. There's a point where the plagues are coming upon Egyptians, but they're not coming upon the Israelites. And I think all of this plays into just God's nature, how he deals with nations, and things that we need to remember in the present state that we're in right now, that God can make a distinction while there's a judgment coming in on a group of people, on a segment of disobedient, that God can preserve his. And we see that reflected in some of the great Psalms, like Psalm 91, where it talks about seeing 1,000 fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but nothing comes near you. Psalms that we need to remember in these things. Psalm 46, God is my refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Though the earth should change, I will not fear. You know, though the mountains quake in the heart of the sea, you know. And so we need to remember those things in these days that we live, and in the days that they lived, they actually saw God make a distinction between them and those that were disobedient, their enemies.